So we know the myth of the phoenix, that it lives a series of full life cycles, famously rising to be reborn out of the ashes. And most American cities have suffered great fires. Heck, I grew up in Chicago, and I remember learning all about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And Atlanta has quite a few great fires in its history, but only Atlanta builds its entire character around the experience of being burned and burned again and rebuilt and rebirthed again. This act of rebirth is the perfect image for our congregation, and in truth, the image, your logo, is part of what drew me to you. Like the city that keeps us, the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Atlanta has risen from the ashes of its history to reshape itself into something new. And I think it matters what stories we tell about our communities. And so I hope you'll sit back, relax, and enjoy some storytelling from the first 6 years of this ministry, my ministry with you at UUCA. I want to tell you 3 stories where events unfolded with mystery and a mystical presence, but also with trust, deep trust, because we trusted one another, we trusted Spirit, we trusted something to guide us through. And many of you are a part of these stories. Many of you seated here or watching it from home are a big part of these stories, because they're also stories of when we said yes to the call beyond us all, and when we said yes to one another when we could have done otherwise. And if this is your first Sunday here, or you are new to UCA, just know that you are now a part of a story still unfolding that someone will tell years from now. So I want to take you back to Freedom Summer, 4 years ago. You remember that? The summer of 2020. We had not yet broken ground on our new building, but we owned this property. It was as though we collectively knew just what to do to claim our place, to feel ourselves here on this earth, in this grassy meadow, in the speeding thoroughfare of North Druid Hills Road. Those early June days, hot, sunny days like this one, a bell rang throughout the nation for George Floyd and for countless Black and brown people who have long suffered, have long been targeted under our racist system of policing in America. And the nation was awakening. The nation was rising up, finally, little by little, but finally. And there was one day when, I don't know whose idea it was, but dozens of us brought makeshift signs and drove up to our brand new property. And for most of us, it was the very first time we had ever been here. We also had not seen each other much in person. Because of the COVID pandemic, we were largely afraid to be in public. And it didn't feel right to go down to the state capitol where so many folks were gathering day after day. The time was wrong to join a throng, for we were still heaven-bent on protecting the most vulnerable among us. That was a guiding phrase for us here at UUCA. We spoke it often in staff meetings, board meetings, COVID task force meetings. Protect the vulnerable. Center the vulnerable. The rest will become clear. Well, I put on my clergy collar, which, since we're storytelling here, I lost it a long time ago, so I just use like a card or like a piece of paper. One time there was like a yogurt cup, but anyway. They're not that expensive, I don't really know. I don't think we had the parking lot yet, but one by one, folks walked out to the edge of the long lawn right on North Druid Hills Road, and I heard someone that day call it Freedom Meadow, or maybe they said, we could call it Freedom Meadow. I can't remember who said that either, but I know people called out in unison, Black Lives Matter. They lifted their signs calling for love and not discrimination. We sang songs of freedom out there. We were not afraid, though maybe we were a bit unsure. I mean, do you remember, those of you who were there, what happened that day? It was like our announcement to the neighborhood about who we are here. It was better than any kind of flyer or email blast we could have sent. And it turned out our neighbors were relieved. The last congregation in this building had folded due to infighting and an ultra-conservative pastor. And the neighborhood was hoping all these years since then for a congregation with more open and welcoming theology, as it turned out. And some of those neighbors quickly made signs at their home and brought their children to stand with us. And then the honking began. People, particularly people of color, but all people, were honking their horns again and again as they drove by us. Folks rolled down their windows and waved. Some folks pulled over and joined us on a whim. I remember one young black woman pulled over and she wanted to pray with me. She was in tears saying, here I was just driving on North Druid Hills Road and all of a sudden I happened upon this circle of support on my commute. I didn't know this kind of support was out here, she said. And at that moment, we knew we had made the right choice. This was where we needed to be in that moment. In the path of 33,000 cars that drive by each day who were just heading home from work, but needed to be reminded of their humanity along the way. It turned out Atlanta needed to know it wasn't just the halls of our state capitol where people cared about Black lives. It was everywhere. Along the highways and byways of our city, we needed not one centralized movement, but pop-up movements everywhere. I think we were among the first places where folks started to have these pop-up demonstrations. I'm just going to say that we were. In support of racial justice at street corners and intersections. It was a significant moment announcing ourselves on our new property, sharing our values beyond the building itself, long before we ever started renovations. It was a moment of moral clarity and of finding a way to say yes to coming together when coming together was so scary. Now this is not a non-linear storytelling, because now I want to take you to the Capitol campaign, which was also 2020. And the odds were against us, I'll say that. Too many major donors remembered a Capitol campaign that had not been successful just a decade earlier. The congregation's numbers were waning, the previous minister had just moved on, and I had been an intern merely months earlier. And as I arrived on the scene in leadership of senior ministry, we were in the middle of a feasibility study that was not going well, and I had on my desk, on my very first day of work as senior minister, a list of staff grievances and demands. The road was more complex than I had realized. I did not actually know how to lead a staff, nor a Capitol campaign, nor build a building, but I did know how to assemble a support team. I had a brilliant committee on ministry here, and I spent some time amassing a small support group of experienced clergy and rabbis in Northeast Atlanta. So I could take advantage of being a new member of a group called the Senior Ministers of Large UU Churches, which was having its next meeting in Los Angeles just a month into my tenure. So you better believe I got myself there. And that first year at that conference of senior ministers, I just kept raising my hand to ask about capital campaigns. Like, is anyone doing a capital campaign? They're like, there's a pandemic. We're not doing that right now. Who would do that? We're doing it. Finally, a group of elders, actually, I think this is just before the pandemic hit, is when I went to LA. Sorry, it was just before that. But still, people were not launching capital campaigns in that moment. But finally, a group of elders, of senior ministers, took pity on me and met with me under the jasmine flowers, where they shared the guys who had helped them with their capital campaigns. There was just one name in repetition: Clote. Jim Clote was an Episcopalian in khaki pants and blue blazers, yet somehow he got Unitarian Universalists. He just understood us and how to engage our values in our vision. And he worked out for us, but really it was you. You just kept saying yes. Ellen Beatty and John Guyton said yes to serving as the capital campaign co-chairs, thank goodness. I asked them to trust me about these Episcopalian consultants from Middle America, and they said yes. They asked you to trust them, and you said yes. And I know that some of us in the congregation were losing sleep and wondering if this would be, in fact, the end of UUCA, this glorious project, doomed to an office park, and then maybe eventually nothing. The flames of doubt and disaster licked our heels as we pushed forward, and Clote sent us a guy named Glenn Wagner, a former conservative Christian pastor and writer who had somewhat recently gone through his own Christian deconstruction and was asking to be placed with a Unitarian Universalist congregation. We said yes to Glenn. Smack dab in the middle of a global pandemic now, Glenn took up residency at an extended stay America a few blocks away, and he came into the UUC office each and every day. Like, even when the rest of the staff were quarantined at home, Glenn came to the office. Sometimes would make copies for us. There were plenty of days in deep pandemic when Glenn was the only person at the UC office. He encouraged us to have face-to-face meetings with each other to discuss the funds we would need for our campaign. Now, this seemed out of touch to ask that, and yet we were so lonely. We longed to see each other. We found a way to say yes to Glenn. And I wish I had a picture of this, but I remember going with, we didn't realize how momentous these things were at the time, but I remember going with Dave Shoquist to meet Emmylou Bales and Gerald Robison in their backyard. They showed us around their beautiful garden in the morning sun, replete with bluebird houses and feeders galore. We sipped cold lemonade and found we were not that afraid to talk about money because we had already crossed the greatest hurdle, which was just getting together. We could not touch nor hug each other nor go indoors, but it was still such a blessing to be out of the house, to be seen by somebody else, not our own families, to laugh together and to remember a time characterized by fear and isolation and a lot of no's, that we could still find ways to say yes. These backyard meetings, these Zoom meetings, were happening all across the congregation. Strangely, being home and isolated made more of us eager to attend our capital campaign visits. In the weirdest season, it felt like the one normal thing you could hang on to. You just kept saying yes to each other. And I feel like you learned Zoom immediately. Like, this congregation was amazing at learning Zoom. There were early victories, surprise gifts we didn't even know were out there. And those surprises made all the difference in the campaign. Each and every yes, each surprise gift was a brick in the yellow brick road leading to our own Emerald City, which was a place we did not know what it looked like, but it was a place where we trusted each other enough to believe and invest in our shared future in times when we weren't sure if there would be a future at all. Before the vaccine, this was before the vaccine, when death and illness reigned, when most of us knew someone who was gravely ill or even dying. Before institutions and governments that we rely on had any answers, we said yes to our own survival. We said, yes, we would survive this, and we would need to have a new campus because we would be alive and vital. We said yes to life and yes to having a future. So that story, that triumphant story. And there was another, these are all from 2020. I just can't remember exactly when, but I remember receiving an email at one point from Georgia State Senator Nan Orrock's office. And I don't know, Nan might be out there. She's usually watching on Sundays. Now, I have a policy when I am invited to speak publicly in seats of great power, always say yes. I find these opportunities to be somewhat mystical and mysterious and full of potential. You never know what can happen. It could be that nothing happens and no one is moved, or something else could happen. I looked up the Georgia State motto and found it an inspiration. Do you know the Georgia State motto? Does anybody know it? Okay, what is it? Okay, Herschel knows it. Wisdom, justice, moderation. That'll preach. Now, I did not see a lot of those qualities in the laws passed in our Gold Dome, or in the way our politicians were conducting themselves in the public square. I did not see those words reflected in their actions. And I began my prayer, they call it, praying to the God of all understanding in that inclusive way that only a UU preacher could. I brought in a Toni Morrison story that I like to use, and I've used it with you, about the preciousness of our responsibility as leaders and stewards of a people and a state. And I certainly used those three words, wisdom, justice, and moderation, as the pillars of my sermon. It was a sermon. Now, I was a short white lady with a Midwestern accent. And I don't think they expected a fiery speech calling them back into that motto they repeated each and every legislative session. When you preach to the Senate, they're not obligated to watch and listen to you. In fact, when I started, they began with their heads down, furiously writing some last-minute notes and preparing for a big debate that day. And I think half of them were also just angry because they were forced to wear masks or something like that. But one by one, I got to tell you, I watched faces rise from their desks and pencils come down on the table. And then I started to hear some amens murmured. And finally, just these wide open eyes. One of those wide open eyes was the lieutenant governor at the time, Jeff Duncan, who you could see behind me in that photo. When I finished, he approached me immediately and asked me this: "Who are you?" He said, this all happened very quickly. He said, "I have never really heard anything like this, not from a pastor." Now, I don't know if that was true or not, but I do believe he was moved. He asked if he could take my card. He asked if I would send him my remarks. He wanted to read them again. He said also he was going through a very difficult time in his political life and his faith life. Now, I recognized in him someone who was lost and in deep discernment about where to go next. And this was all while folks were taking pictures and ushering me off the podium. He was whispering these things to me. The next thing I knew, the senators were lining up to meet me and shake my hand, and it wasn't just Democrats. Some of the longtime Republicans asked where I had learned oration and said they loved hearing a pastor preach from the state motto as the text. The line to meet me was all the way to the back of the room, and I stood there for about half an hour before finally they needed to get on to the business of the day, which was accomplishing nothing much, I assume. But it was the opening day of the legislative session, so it was an exciting day. Now, as I took my leave, The man who worked as a Senate usher, the man who held the door open for folks, said to me, "Now, I've worked here over 30 years, and I've only seen them line up for a preacher like that once or twice in my time. The way you used the state motto to say what you needed to say, that was undeniable," he said. Now, a few weeks later, I received a letter from Jeff Duncan himself, repeating back some of the details of my speech and how they had helped him think through some things. I'm not going to take full credit. I can feel myself already trying to take full credit. I'm not going to do that. But I did happen to notice a recent headline just last week, where former Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, longtime Georgia Republican, publicly endorsed Joe Biden for president. Now, this is really a story about all of us, about our fellow member, Senator Nan Orox, and the way she lives her UU faith every single day on that Senate floor. Letting her relationships lead her, staying friendly. I got to see her work her magic, staying friendly and connected to those so far across the aisle, it would be easy to cut them off. But she knows where she stands, and she was proud to show off her UU faith that day and to be more fully known what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist amongst her colleagues in the Georgia State Senate. And this story, this is also about all of us, the ways we deal in hope with one another, taking some chances and those opportunities to really share our faith loud and proud, pushing through overwhelming odds and staying in the conversation, staying in the work, moving mountains to continue uplifting the worth and dignity of all people, and showing up for justice every single day like Nan does, and staying open to the possibility that people can be called to their better angels. Someday, even when it's a little too late, Jeff Duncan, frankly. Now, these are just 3 stories from the past 6 years, the first 6 years of my ministry with you here at UUCA. But honestly, they are only scratching the surface of our resilience. When I talk about our resilience, I'm not imagining a marathon man running the distance. That's an exhausting image. It's not possible for any one of us, me included, to maintain that kind of pace. No, this is more like the Olympic torch, the one that gets passed along from person to person across a vast landscape. With each handoff, the flame becomes clearer and brighter, lighting our way through the darkest nights and the most terrifying, confusing times. One of the gifts of this relationship between us, congregation and minister, is the mirror I can lift up and reflect you back to yourself. Because I see you on your worst days, and I see you on your best days. And so I think I can accurately describe the fullness of you. You are people of the Phoenix, people who have been burned by conflict, by disappointment, people who have lost things that are precious, lost good and kind leaders like Howard Reese and so many others. The architecturally meaningful building that was built just for you. You've lost ministers and staff. You know, we still haven't had a meaningful memorial moment for Reverend Edward Frost, in my opinion, and I'd like to rectify that this year. And you have gathered yourselves and rebirthed to flaming glory, a community that knows how to meet the moment, a community that risks so much for love, for hope, for the children here, for the beloved elders here, for the dream of multicultural, multiracial, beloved community that is honest and authentic and real. The Phoenix does so much more than just die and get reborn. It also spends some time just simply being beautiful. existing, attending to the present with wisdom and grace. And we can be that phoenix too in our alive and well era. It's exciting when the rebirth happens. That's the part everybody talks about and thinks about. But we need to be here for the more mundane parts of our life cycle too. After all, this is what we were reborn to do. To minister to one another in all gladness. To be a beacon and a hub for the community around us. To offer the hope of a pluralistic faith that values wisdom and justice and will stand for equity in the face of oppression. We will do what we have to do. Because we are people of the Phoenix, we will forever rise up. Amen? When we are facing terrible racial injustice and the death of George Floyd and so many others, we rise up. When facing incredible odds against our success in deep pandemic, we don't fade away like ash, we rise up. When facing the halls of Congress filled with bigotry and disdain for all we cherish, we don't shrink. What do? We rise up. When facing a building project that would include all of our diverse needs and desires, we don't smolder and stay small. What do? When facing a financial situation with overwhelming stakes, we don't burn our hopes away. What do? When facing a global pandemic that would keep us apart, keep us lonely and isolated, we don't drift away, don't drift off like ash. What do? We rise up. This is who we are. People of the Phoenix, courageous, hopeful, doers, lovers, singers, artists, justice makers. We rise again and again like the Phoenix. You should rise. Like the Phoenix ablaze. Like the Phoenix ablaze with color, beauty, creativity, and power. When we rise together.